Gate agent kicks black woman in a wheelchair, and granddaughter's bold move freezes the entire airline. But what that gate agent said to a 73-year-old civil rights hero before her 15-year-old granddaughter went viral will make you question everything you thought you knew about progress in America. Richard Brennan's voice cut through the gate area at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport with the kind of certainty that comes from 15 years of unchallenged authority. These tickets seem irregular. The payment method is flagged in our system. This looks like ticket fraud. I can't allow boarding until verification. Step aside. You people always try to game the system, don't you? Always looking for handouts, always trying to get something you didn't earn. The words hit Evelyn Morrison like a physical blow. She sat in her wheelchair, her partially paralyzed left side trembling, her hands gripping the armrests as tears began streaming down her weathered face. Beside her, 15-year-old Jasmine stood frozen, her grandmother's boarding pass clutched in shaking hands, unable to process why this gate agent was looking at them like criminals when all they'd done was show up to board a flight they'd saved for months to afford. And here's what we need to understand about racism in 2025. It's not some relic from history books. It's not something that ended when laws changed or when hashtags trended. It's alive and thriving at every level of society, in airports and schools and hospitals, where black people are still treated like suspects before citizens, like frauds before customers, like problems before human beings. And it's gotten worse than the civil rights era because back then at least you knew where you stood. Signs told you which doors you couldn't enter. Now the doors are unmarked but locked just the same, and when you try to walk through with a valid ticket in your hand, someone with a badge and a screen decides you look suspicious and your access gets flagged and your humanity gets questioned and your emergency gets dismissed while they make you prove you deserve the seat you already paid for. Evelyn felt shock and humiliation wash over her, but underneath it was a terrible recognition. She was 73 years old, had marched in Selma, had been beaten by police for demanding the right to vote, had spent 50 years fighting for the dignity this gate agent was now stripping away with a few typed keys and a suspicious glare. She'd thought things had changed. Had believed her granddaughter would inherit a better world. But sitting in this wheelchair being accused of fraud while trying to get to a hospital that might save her life, she understood with crushing clarity that the fight wasn't over. It had just found new battlefields and new weapons. The scene at Gate C-17 looked like an injustice with a boarding time. Evelyn Morrison sat in her wheelchair visibly struggling, her breathing labored, her face showing the strain of someone whose body was failing while bureaucracy trapped her in place. The stroke 2 years ago had left her partially paralyzed, dependent on the wheelchair, vulnerable in ways that made moments like this not just humiliating but dangerous. Jasmine, just 15 years old and trying to be brave for her grandmother, held out the printed confirmation email with trembling hands. "Sir, we bought these tickets online 3 weeks ago. Here's the confirmation. Here's the receipt showing the $847 we paid. My grandmother has a heart surgery consultation at Johns Hopkins Hospital in 18 hours. We can't miss this flight." Richard barely glanced at the email. "Ma'am, don't raise your voice. Suspicious tickets require additional screening. I'm going to need you both to step aside while I verify this with our fraud department." "But we're not committing fraud," Jasmine said, her voice cracking with desperation and confusion. "We saved for months for these tickets. My grandmother is sick. She needs to see specialists. Please, just look at the confirmation number." "Step aside," Richard repeated, his voice harder now. "You're holding up the boarding process for passengers with legitimate tickets." Around them, other passengers were beginning to board. A businessman in a suit walked past, glancing at Evelyn in her wheelchair and Jasmine with her papers, then looking quickly away. A family with small children gave them a wide berth, the parents whispering to each other. A college-aged girl pulled out her phone and started recording, but she didn't speak up, didn't challenge what was happening, just documented it for her social media feed. Evelyn tried to speak, her words slurred slightly from the stroke's lingering effects. "Please, I need to use the restroom. I've been sitting here for so long." "You can't leave the gate area during an investigation," Richard said without looking at her. "If you leave, I'll have to assume you're abandoning the tickets and I'll release your seats." "My grandmother has a medical condition," Jasmine said, her voice rising with panic now. "She can't hold it indefinitely. She's in pain. Can't you see she's suffering? That's not my responsibility, Richard said, turning back to his computer screen. If you'd planned better, you wouldn't be in this situation. Minutes stretched into an eternity. 10 minutes became 20 became 30. Richard made phone calls that seemed deliberately slow, talking to people about verification processes while Evelyn sat trembling in her wheelchair and Jasmine stood beside her fighting back tears of frustration and fear. Another flight to Baltimore was called for boarding at the next gate over. Passengers lined up, showed their tickets, and walked down the jetway while Evelyn and Jasmine watched their chance to make the appointment slipping away. If you believe no child should ever have to watch their grandmother humiliated like this, keep watching. If you think racial discrimination at airports is something we left in the 1960s, you need to see what happens next. And if you've ever been treated like you don't belong somewhere because of how you look, drop a comment below and tell us your story. We're reading every single one. Also tell us where you're watching from and what time you are watching right now. This story doesn't end the way you think. Hit that like button if you stand against racism, and subscribe to this channel because we're exposing these incidents that airlines don't want you to see. 45 minutes passed. Then 60. Jasmine called American Airlines customer service on her cell phone, was put on hold for 12 minutes, got disconnected, called back, was put on hold again. She tried explaining to automated systems that this was an emergency, that her grandmother needed to board, that they had valid tickets, but the robot voices just kept offering her options that led nowhere. Evelyn's breathing was getting more labored. Her face had gone pale. She gripped Jasmine's hand with her good hand and whispered, "Baby, I don't feel good. My chest hurts." Jasmine's panic shifted to terror. She looked at Richard, who was still typing slowly at his computer. "My grandmother is having a medical crisis. She needs help. Please call someone. Call medical services. Do something." Richard glanced up briefly. If it's truly urgent, you should have planned better. Maybe you should have thought about her health before booking a flight you apparently couldn't properly pay for. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. An elderly woman in visible distress being blamed for her own suffering. A child begging for help being dismissed. And all around them, passengers boarding flights, walking past, seeing everything and doing nothing. 90 minutes. 3 flights to Baltimore had departed. Evelyn was crying softly, her body shaking, her breathing shallow. And Richard was still making phone calls, still typing, still treating them like criminals who needed to prove their innocence before he'd grant them access to the seats they'd already purchased. Jasmine looked at her grandmother, looked at the gate agent who'd trapped them in this nightmare, looked at all the silent witnesses recording but not helping, and something inside her shifted from fear to fury. She stood up, pulled out her phone, opened her livestream app, and started recording. And what she said next would be heard by 50,000 people in 3 minutes and change everything for everyone at Gate C-17. But to understand how a civil rights hero ended up detained at an airport gate for 90 minutes while her 15-year-old granddaughter begged for help, you need to go back to that morning in Dallas when hope still felt stronger than fear and Evelyn Morrison believed this trip might save her life. Evelyn Morrison was 73 years old, a retired social worker who'd spent 45 years fighting for foster children and families in crisis. But long before that career, she'd been a young woman who marched with John Lewis in Selma, who'd been beaten by police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, who'd stared down dogs and fire hoses for the right to vote. She'd witnessed segregation firsthand, remembered colored-only signs on water fountains and bathroom doors, remembered being told where she could and couldn't sit based solely on her skin. She'd married her husband James in 1968, raised 4 children in a small house in South Dallas, worked 2 jobs to put them through college. James had died 6 years ago from a heart attack, leaving Evelyn alone in that house with their memories and her growing collection of health problems. She was a respected elder at Greater Hope Baptist Church, volunteered at the community center teaching young people about civil rights history, kept photographs of her protest days on her living room wall so her grandchildren would never forget the price that had been paid for their freedoms. 2 years ago, Evelyn had suffered a severe stroke that left her partially paralyzed on her left side. She'd lost some mobility, some independence, some of the fierce strength that had carried her through decades of activism. Now she used a wheelchair, took handfuls of medications every day, struggled with tasks that used to be simple. But her mind was sharp, her spirit unbroken, her commitment to dignity and justice as fierce as it had been when she was 25 and marching for her rights. Recently, her heart had started giving her trouble. Arrhythmia, her doctors said. Dangerous, potentially fatal. They'd referred her to specialists at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, one of the best cardiac programs in the country. The appointment had taken 3 months to schedule. It was her best chance at treatment that might extend her life, might give her more years to see her grandchildren grow up, might let her keep fighting the fights that still needed fighting. Jasmine Morrison was Evelyn's youngest granddaughter, just 15 years old, a sophomore at Roosevelt High School. Her mother, Evelyn's daughter Patricia, was a single parent working as a nurse at Methodist Hospital, pulling night shifts and double shifts to keep their family afloat. Jasmine had essentially grown up in her grandmother's house, spending afternoons after school at Evelyn's kitchen table doing homework while her grandmother told stories about the movement, about courage, about standing up when the world tried to push you down. The bond between them was deep and tender. Evelyn had taught Jasmine about their history, about the ancestors who'd fought and died so she could attend integrated schools and vote and live without the legal segregation that had defined Evelyn's youth. She'd taught her granddaughter to be proud, to be strong, to never accept injustice even when fighting it was hard. Jasmine had learned those lessons well. She was a straight A student, mature beyond her years, responsible in the way that children who grow up watching their parents struggle often become. When it became clear that Evelyn needed someone to accompany her to Baltimore for the consultation, that she couldn't manage airports and travel alone in her condition, Jasmine had volunteered immediately. They'd saved for months to afford the tickets. Evelyn's social security check. Jasmine's babysitting money from watching neighborhood kids. Patricia had contributed what she could from her nursing salary. $847 for 2 round-trip tickets to Baltimore felt like a fortune, but it was an investment in Evelyn's life, in the possibility of more birthdays and holidays and Sunday dinners together. That Friday morning, they'd gotten ready with careful preparation. Jasmine had helped her grandmother dress, had packed medications and medical records, had made sure they had snacks and water for the journey. They'd left the house at 6 a.m. in a Lyft, Evelyn in her wheelchair, Jasmine pushing their shared carry-on bag. At Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, check-in had gone smoothly. The agent at the counter had been kind, had processed Evelyn's wheelchair assistance request, had tagged their bag and printed boarding passes. Security had been normal. TSA agents had helped Evelyn through the accessible lane, had been respectful and efficient. Everything had seemed fine. At gate C-17, they'd arrived 90 minutes before their scheduled departure, plenty of time. Evelyn had settled into a waiting area seat while Jasmine kept the wheelchair nearby. They'd watched other passengers arrive, had talked about what they'd do in Baltimore after the consultation, had been nervous but hopeful. When the gate agent called for early boarding assistance, when Richard Brennan had announced that passengers needing extra time could approach the desk, Jasmine had felt relief. They'd get to board first, get Evelyn settled comfortably, avoid the stress of crowds. She'd wheeled her grandmother up to the desk with their boarding passes ready, with confirmation emails printed just in case, with all their documentation organized the way Evelyn had taught her to always be prepared. Richard Brennan was 48 years old, a 15-year veteran gate agent with American Airlines. He looked professional in his uniform, his name badge polished, his expression neutral as they approached. At first, he'd seemed fine. Had greeted them with the standard "Can I see your boarding passes and IDs?" But when he'd looked at their documents, when he'd pulled up their reservation on his computer, something had shifted in his face. A tightening around his eyes. A subtle change in posture. The professional courtesy had drained away, replaced by something that looked like suspicion. He'd started examining their boarding passes with exaggerated scrutiny, holding them up to the light, typing slowly into his computer, his expression growing more skeptical with each passing second. Jasmine had noticed the change but hadn't understood it yet, hadn't recognized the signs of what was coming. "These tickets seem irregular," Richard had said, his voice taking on an edge. "How did you purchase them?" And that's when the nightmare had begun. When reasonable questions had turned into accusations. When verification had become detention. when a sick elderly woman and her teenage granddaughter had been transformed in Richard Brennan's eyes from passengers with rights into suspects who needed to prove they deserved the seats they'd already paid for. Now, 90 minutes later, Evelyn sat trembling in her wheelchair with her chest hurting and her breathing labored while Richard continued his deliberately slow investigation. And Jasmine, who'd been raised by a woman who'd fought for civil rights, who'd been taught to speak up against injustice, who'd inherited her grandmother's courage even if she didn't feel brave, was about to do something that would freeze an entire airline and force everyone to see what they'd been ignoring. She pulled out her phone, opened her livestream app, and prepared to use the only weapon she had, her voice, her grandmother's story, and the power of witnesses who couldn't look away once the truth was being broadcast live. Richard Brennan picked up his desk phone with the kind of deliberate slowness that made it clear he was in no hurry to resolve this situation. He dialed a number, put the call on speaker so Evelyn and Jasmine could hear the automated hold music, and returned to typing at his computer with exaggerated focus. "We're experiencing higher than normal call volumes," the recorded voice announced. "Your estimated wait time is 23 minutes. Jasmine looked at her grandmother who was trembling in her wheelchair, her face showing the strain of someone trying to hold herself together while her body betrayed her. "How long is this going to take?" "We have a flight in 40 minutes. Richard didn't look up from his screen. "As long as it takes to verify the legitimacy of your purchase. Fraud investigations can't be rushed." "But we showed you everything," Jasmine said, desperation creeping into her voice. "The confirmation email. The credit card receipt. The charge on the bank statement. What else do you need?" "I need to follow protocol," Richard said, still not making eye contact. "Suspicious transactions require thorough verification." The hold music droned on. Other passengers lined up at the desk for normal boarding, glancing at Evelyn and Jasmine with curiosity and mild annoyance at the holdup. Richard helped them efficiently, scanning their boarding passes, directing them to the jetway, his demeanor friendly and professional with everyone except the two people he'd decided were problems. At 28 minutes past the hour, the announcement came over the PA system. "American Airlines Flight 2847 to Baltimore, Washington International is now boarding all zones. We invite our first-class passengers and those needing extra time to begin boarding at this time." Jasmine's heart sank as she watched passengers walk past them down the jetway. That was their flight. Their carefully planned, expensively purchased tickets to get Evelyn to Johns Hopkins. And they were sitting at the desk being treated like criminals while it boarded without them. "Sir, that's our flight," Jasmine said, panic rising in her voice. "We need to board now or we'll miss it." "Verification is still pending," Richard said without looking up. "You'll need to wait." 15 minutes later, the final boarding call was announced. "Last call for American Airlines Flight 2847 to Baltimore, Washington International. All remaining passengers please proceed to the gate immediately." Jasmine stood up, her hands shaking. "Please, my grandmother has a consultation in 18 hours. She needs to be on that flight." "Should have purchased legitimate tickets then," Richard said, finally looking at her with an expression of cold satisfaction. "The jetway door is closing." They watched helplessly as the door sealed shut and their flight pushed back from the gate. The first chance to get Evelyn to Baltimore, gone. Evelyn's good hand gripped the armrest of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles went white. Her voice, slurred slightly from the lingering effects of her stroke, came out barely above a whisper. "Baby, I need some water. My mouth is so dry from these medications." Richard pointed toward the far end of the terminal. "Vending machines are down that way. About 200 feet. Can you get her some water?" Jasmine asked. "She can't walk that far." "I can't leave my post," Richard said, turning back to his computer. "I have boarding responsibilities." Jasmine looked at the vending machines in the distance, looked at her grandmother's wheelchair, started to calculate whether she could wheel her there and back before Richard decided they'd violated some rule about leaving the gate area. "Go ahead, baby," Evelyn said weakly. "I'll be okay here for a minute." Jasmine had barely turned the wheelchair toward the vending machines when Richard's voice stopped her. "Where do you think you're going?" "To get my grandmother water," Jasmine said. "Like you just told us to do." "You can't leave the gate area during an active investigation," Richard said. "If you leave, I'll have to assume you're abandoning your tickets and I'll release your seats on the next flight." Jasmine felt tears of frustration burning her eyes. So my grandmother can't have water? She's diabetic. She takes medications that make her dehydrated. She needs water. That's not my problem, Richard said. You should have prepared better before coming to the airport. 45 minutes passed. The hold music on Richard's phone call had cycled through the same 8 songs 4 times. He'd made another call that also went to hold. He'd helped at least 30 other passengers board other flights, his demeanor pleasant and efficient with all of them. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in her wheelchair, her face showing increasing distress. Jasmine leaned down. What's wrong, Grandma? I need to use the restroom, Evelyn whispered, her voice thick with embarrassment. I really need to go. Jasmine straightened and addressed Richard with as much calm as she could muster. My grandmother needs to use the bathroom. The accessible restroom is right over there, 50 feet away. We'll be back in 5 minutes. She can't leave the gate area until this investigation is concluded, Richard said. Security protocol. She has to use the bathroom, Jasmine said, her voice rising. She's a human being with basic needs. She can't hold it indefinitely. Then perhaps she should have considered that before attempting to board with questionable tickets, Richard said, his voice carrying an edge of cruelty that made it clear he was enjoying this power he held over them. Evelyn's face crumpled and tears began sliding down her cheeks. Please, she said, her dignity stripped away by desperation. I can't hold it. I'm going to have an accident. Please let me go to the bathroom. Jasmine knelt beside her grandmother's wheelchair, her own tears falling now, rage and helplessness warring inside her. It's okay, Grandma. We'll figure this out. Maybe I can find someone else. Maybe there's a supervisor. I already contacted my supervisor, Richard said. She's aware of the situation and agrees that security protocols must be maintained during fraud investigations. This isn't about fraud, Jasmine said, her voice shaking. This isn't about tickets or verification or protocols. You decided we don't belong here the second you saw us. You saw a black woman in a wheelchair and you decided she must have stolen these tickets somehow because how else would someone like her afford them, right? That's what this is really about. Richard's face hardened. Ma'am, if you continue to make accusations, I'll have to call security to have you removed from the terminal entirely. Your attitude is making this situation worse. My attitude? Jasmine's voice cracked. My grandmother is sitting here in pain, being denied bathroom access, being denied water, missing flights she paid for, and you're worried about my attitude? The second Baltimore flight was called for boarding at a nearby gate. Jasmine watched passengers line up, board, depart. Another chance gone. And they were still sitting here, trapped by a man with a badge and a computer who'd decided their humanity was less important than his suspicions. Evelyn's breathing had become more labored. Jasmine noticed her grandmother's face was pale, her forehead beaded with sweat despite the air conditioning. The hand that wasn't paralyzed kept moving to her chest, pressing there as if trying to ease some pressure building inside. This is what racism looks like when it has authority and a uniform. Not burning crosses or explicit slurs, though those existed too. But this quieter, bureaucratic cruelty. This weaponization of policy and protocol against people whose skin color makes them suspects before citizens. This casual dismissal of humanity in service of power. Richard was teaching them what their grandmother's generation had tried to protect them from learning. That no matter how legitimate your tickets, no matter how valid your documents, no matter how urgent your need, there would always be someone ready to look at your black face and decide you were lying, cheating, stealing, scamming. Someone ready to make you prove you deserved the same rights and dignity afforded without question to white passengers who walked past you every minute to board their flights while you sat detained and suffering. As Evelyn's medical condition deteriorated with each passing minute, as her blood pressure climbed and her chest pain intensified, Richard Brennan's cruelty was just beginning to reveal its full scope and its potentially deadly consequences. 75 minutes into their detention at Gate C-17, another announcement came over the PA system. American Airlines Flight 3492 to Baltimore Washington International is now boarding all zones. Jasmine looked up with desperate hope. That's the second flight to Baltimore. Sir, can we please board this one? You've had over an hour to verify our tickets. Richard glanced at his computer screen, then at them, his expression unmoved. Verification is still in process. You'll need to continue waiting. But there might not be another flight today, Jasmine said, her voice breaking. My grandmother's consultation is tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. If we don't get to Baltimore tonight, we'll miss it completely. That's unfortunate, Richard said, turning back to his screen. Perhaps next time you'll ensure your travel arrangements are above suspicion before booking. They watched helplessly as the second Baltimore flight boarded, filled, pushed back from the gate, and disappeared down the taxiway. 2 chances gone. Evelyn's appointment slipping further out of reach with each passing minute. Around them, the gate area was full of passengers waiting for other flights. Some glanced at Evelyn in her wheelchair, at Jasmine standing beside her looking increasingly desperate, but most deliberately looked away. Their phones came out to check boarding times, to scroll social media, to avoid engaging with the obvious suffering happening 10 feet away. A young white woman, maybe 28 years old, approached tentatively. She'd been watching for the last 20 minutes, her discomfort visible. Excuse me, is there a problem? Can I help somehow? Richard's head snapped up, his voice sharp. Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. This is an airline security matter. Please step back. The woman, whose name was Sarah, looked at Evelyn's tear-stained face, at Jasmine's desperate expression. I just thought, if they need help or if there's been some misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, Richard interrupted. These passengers are under investigation for ticket fraud. I need you to step away from the desk immediately. Sarah hesitated, looked like she wanted to argue, wanted to challenge his authority. But Richard's badge and uniform and position behind the official desk created a power dynamic she didn't know how to overcome. She retreated back to her seat, pulled out her phone, but didn't call anyone or report anything. Just went back to waiting for her own flight, her brief impulse toward helping extinguished by institutional authority and the social discomfort of making a scene. Jasmine pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed American Airlines customer service for the 4th time. She'd tried 3 times already, been put on hold for 15 minutes each time, then disconnected. This time she got through to the automated menu. If you're calling about booking a flight, press 1. If you're calling about an existing reservation, press 2. If you're calling about baggage, press 3. She pressed 2, then navigated through 5 more menus before finally getting to hold music. Your call is very important to us. A representative will be with you shortly. Current wait time is approximately 38 minutes. She stayed on the line, speakerphone pressed to her ear, listening to the same instrumental version of a pop song loop endlessly while her grandmother's breathing grew more ragged beside her. Attempt 5. Attempt 6. Each time the same automated maze, the same hold music, the same promise that someone would help shortly that never materialized. By attempt 17, Jasmine wanted to throw her phone across the terminal. Evelyn's hand suddenly gripped Jasmine's arm with surprising strength. Her voice came out strained and frightened. Baby, my chest hurts. It's getting hard to breathe right. Jasmine looked at her grandmother's face and felt terror wash over her. Evelyn was pale, almost gray. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Her left hand kept returning to her chest, pressing there like she was trying to hold something inside that wanted to break free. Sir, Jasmine said urgently to Richard. My grandmother is having a medical crisis. She needs help right now. Please call someone. Call a medic. Call airport medical services. Please. Richard glanced over, his expression annoyed rather than concerned. Ma'am, I'm not a doctor. That's not my responsibility. If you believe there's a medical emergency, you're free to call 911 yourself. I'm calling them right now, Jasmine said, her hands shaking as she tried to dial. But you're the airport employee. You have direct access to airport medical teams. You could get help here faster. And I've told you that's not my responsibility, Richard said coldly. My job is to verify tickets and maintain gate security. Medical issues are not part of my duties. An elderly white man sitting 3 rows away had been watching with growing horror. He stood up slowly, pulled a bottle of water from his bag, and walked toward Evelyn. Here, he said gently. You look like you need this. Richard moved quickly, intercepting him before he could hand the water to Evelyn. Sir, I need you to step back. Do not interfere with an ongoing investigation. I'm just giving her some water, the man said, confused. She's clearly in distress. And I'm telling you not to interfere, Richard said firmly. These passengers are being detained for questioning. Any interference could be considered obstruction. The elderly man looked at Richard, at Evelyn struggling to breathe, at Jasmine begging silently with her eyes for him to push back, to insist, to use whatever privilege his age and race and gender gave him to override this cruelty. But he didn't. He stepped back, returned to his seat, sat down with his unopened water bottle, and did nothing more. Another witness. Another person who saw injustice and chose comfort over courage. Evelyn began crying softly, her body shaking with sobs that made her breathing even more labored. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. Jazzy, I can't. It hurts too much. I'm so tired. Jasmine knelt beside her grandmother's wheelchair, taking her hand, fighting back her own tears because she needed to be strong, needed to figure out how to save them from this nightmare. Grandma, stay with me. Help is coming. Someone will help us. But as she looked around at all the passengers watching and filming and doing nothing, at Richard continuing his deliberately slow investigation, at the system that had trapped them here for an hour and a half with no recourse and no escape, Jasmine realized with crushing clarity that no one was coming to save them. If you're watching this and thinking someone should help them, but you haven't subscribed to this channel that exposes these injustices and force accountability, then what made you different from those passengers sitting silent in gate C-17? Please subscribe now. Don't just watch suffering. Amplify it until systems have to respond. The blood pressure monitor on Evelyn's wrist, the one her doctors had given her to track her hypertension, flashed a warning. 178/110. Dangerously high. Crisis level. The kind of reading that preceded strokes and heart attacks and organ damage. Jasmine saw the numbers and felt her medical experiences kick in even through her panic. Those are stroke-level numbers, she said to Richard, showing him the monitor. My grandmother is in hypertensive crisis. That means her blood pressure is so high it's damaging her organs right now. She needs emergency medical intervention within minutes or she could die. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Richard glanced at the monitor with practiced indifference. Like I said, medical issues aren't my responsibility. If you're truly concerned, take her to an emergency room. We can't leave because you won't let us, Jasmine said, her voice rising to near shouting. You've trapped us here. You've detained us. You've denied bathroom access and water and medical care. You're killing her. Don't you understand that? Your investigation into tickets that are completely legitimate is killing my grandmother. Your attitude is making this situation worse, Richard said, his voice hard. If you continue raising your voice and causing disruption, I'll have security remove both of you from the terminal entirely. Then you definitely won't make any flights to Baltimore. The threat hung in the air. The power he held over them was absolute and arbitrary. He could make their situation even worse, could have them forcibly removed, could ensure they never got to Johns Hopkins, and there was nothing they could do to stop him. Another announcement. American Airlines Flight 4156 to Baltimore Washington International, our final flight of the day to that destination, will begin boarding in approximately 15 minutes. The last flight. Their final chance. And they were still sitting here, still detained, still being treated like criminals, while Evelyn's blood pressure climbed and her breathing deteriorated and the minutes ticked away toward a missed appointment that might be her last chance at life. Jasmine looked at her grandmother, looked at the gate agent who held their fate in his hands and seemed to take satisfaction in their suffering, looked at the silent witnesses recording but not helping, and something inside her broke and rebuilt itself into something harder and more determined. She'd been raised by a woman who'd marched in Selma, who'd faced dogs and fire hoses, who'd been beaten by police for demanding her rights. Evelyn had taught her that sometimes you have to stand up even when you're terrified. Sometimes you have to make noise even when authority tells you to be quiet. Sometimes survival requires refusing to accept injustice even when acceptance seems easier. Jasmine was watching her grandmother suffer and realizing that no one was coming to save them, that every official channel had failed, that calling customer service and showing documents and being polite and following rules had gotten them nothing but 90 minutes of escalating cruelty. and she was about to make a decision that would stop the entire airport in its tracks. At exactly 90 minutes into their detention, the final boarding announcement came for the last Baltimore flight of the day. American Airlines Flight 4156 to Baltimore Washington International is now boarding all passengers. This is our final flight to Baltimore today. Jasmine's heart sank as she watched passengers line up at the next gate over, boarding the last chance they had. She looked at her grandmother, who was now visibly struggling, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her face a mask of pain and exhaustion. Evelyn's blood pressure monitor flashed again. 182/115. Higher than before. Moving from dangerous into critical territory. Jasmine had studied enough in her biology classes to know what those numbers meant. Stroke risk, heart attack risk, organ failure risk. Her grandmother was dying slowly in this airport chair while a gate agent played God with her life. "Grandma," Jasmine said, kneeling beside the wheelchair and taking Evelyn's trembling hand. "Stay with me. I'm going to fix this. I promise I'm going to fix this." Evelyn's eyes were unfocused, her breathing shallow. She looked at her granddaughter with an expression that broke Jasmine's heart. It was the look of someone who'd fought their whole life and was too tired to keep fighting, who'd marched and protested and demanded justice for decades and was watching it all mean nothing as she sat detained and dying in an airport. "Jazzy," Evelyn whispered, her voice so weak Jasmine had to lean close to hear. "I can't miss this appointment. Dr. Richardson said this is my last chance. If I don't get this evaluation, if they can't do the surgery, my heart is going to fail within months. This trip isn't about getting treatment. It's about finding out if treatment is even possible anymore." The full weight of what was being stolen from them crashed over Jasmine. Not just a flight. Not just an appointment. But potentially her grandmother's last chance at life. And Richard Brennan, with his fraud investigation that had no basis, with his suspicious tickets that had shown no actual flags, with his deliberate cruelty disguised as protocol, was taking that chance away minute by minute. "I know, Grandma," Jasmine said, tears streaming down her face now. "I know. And we're going to get there. I swear to you we're going to get there." She stood up and approached Richard's desk one more time, her voice shaking but determined. "Sir, my grandmother is in hypertensive crisis. That means her blood pressure is so high she's at immediate risk of stroke or heart attack. She needs medical attention right now, and she needs to get to Baltimore for a consultation that could save her life. Please, I'm begging you. Let us board that flight or call for emergency medical help. Please." Richard didn't even look up from his computer. "I've explained this multiple times. Verification is pending. You cannot board until the process is complete. And medical emergencies are not my responsibility." "Then what is your responsibility?" Jasmine asked, her voice breaking. "What exactly is your job here if not to help passengers? What are you actually doing besides torturing an elderly disabled woman?" "My responsibility is maintaining security and preventing fraud," Richard said, finally meeting her eyes with cold satisfaction. "Something you clearly don't understand or appreciate." "There's no fraud," Jasmine said desperately. "You know there's no fraud. You've had 90 minutes to find something wrong with our tickets and you've found nothing because there's nothing to find. You're doing this because we're black. Because you looked at my grandmother in her wheelchair and decided she couldn't possibly afford these tickets legitimately. That's what this is really about. If you continue making baseless accusations, I will call security," Richard said, his hand moving toward his phone. "Final warning." Jasmine tried one more time to wheel her grandmother toward the gate where the last Baltimore flight was boarding, thinking maybe if they could just get close enough, maybe another gate agent would see the crisis and override Richard's cruelty. But Richard stood up and physically moved to block their path, his body creating a barrier between them and the jetway. "You are not dismissed," he said firmly. "If you attempt to leave this area, I will have security escort you out of the terminal entirely. You'll be banned from this airport and you'll face federal charges for interfering with airport operations." "We're not interfering," Jasmine said, her voice rising with desperation. "We're trying to board a flight we paid for. We're trying to save my grandmother's life." "Then you should have thought about that before purchasing tickets through questionable means," Richard said. "Actions have consequences." The last passengers were boarding flight 4156. The gate agent there was making final boarding calls. In 2 minutes, that door would close and their last chance would be gone. Evelyn whispered something so quietly Jasmine almost didn't hear it. "What, Grandma? What did you say?" Evelyn's eyes focused on her granddaughter's face with sudden clarity despite her pain. She spoke slowly, each word an effort. "I didn't survive Selma to die in an airport because some man decided I don't deserve dignity. Make them see me, baby. Make them see what they're doing." And in that moment, Jasmine understood what her grandmother was asking her to do. What she was giving her permission to do. What she needed her to do. Evelyn had spent her life making people see injustice they wanted to ignore. Had marched and protested and put her body on the line to force America to acknowledge the humanity of black people. Had been beaten and arrested and terrorized for demanding to be seen. Now she was asking her 15-year-old granddaughter to do the same thing. To make noise. To refuse to be invisible. To force everyone in this terminal to witness what was happening and choose what side they were on. Jasmine pulled out her phone, opened her social media app, and pressed the live stream button. Her hands shook as she turned the camera on herself and her grandmother and Richard and began to speak in a voice that was terrified but determined. And then Jasmine made a decision that would stop the entire airport in its tracks, that would force thousands of witnesses to see what one gate agent and dozens of passengers had been content to ignore, and that would freeze an entire airline as the truth went viral faster than any plane could fly. Jasmine raised her phone, making sure the camera captured everything. Her voice, shaking but clear, began to carry across the entire gate area. "My name is Jasmine Morrison. I'm 15 years old. My grandmother is Evelyn Morrison. She's 73 years old and she's sitting right here in this wheelchair." She turned the camera to show Evelyn, slumped in her chair, breathing heavily, her face gray with pain and exhaustion. The blood pressure monitor on her wrist flashed its warning numbers clearly visible on the screen. "My grandmother marched with John Lewis in Selma, Alabama. She was beaten by police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge for demanding the right to vote. She spent 50 years fighting for civil rights so that people like me wouldn't have to face the discrimination she faced." Jasmine's voice grew stronger, fueled by righteous anger and desperate love. "And right now, she's being denied her paid seat on a flight to Baltimore because this man," she turned the camera to show Richard's face clearly, "this gate agent named Richard Brennan decided our tickets look suspicious. The only thing suspicious here is that a black woman in a wheelchair is being treated like a criminal for buying a plane ticket." Passengers around them were pulling out their phones, some recording Jasmine, some recording Richard, all of them suddenly paying attention in a way they hadn't for the previous 90 minutes. "We have valid tickets," Jasmine continued, holding up their boarding passes to the camera. "We have confirmation emails. We have credit card receipts. We have everything you're supposed to have. And we've been detained here for 90 minutes while this man makes fake phone calls and pretends to investigate fraud that doesn't exist." Her voice cracked with emotion. "My grandmother has been denied bathroom access. She's been denied water. She's been denied the chance to board 3 separate flights to Baltimore. And now she's having a medical crisis right here in this airport and he's telling us that's not his responsibility." She turned the camera back to Evelyn, zooming in on the blood pressure monitor. "That number right there? 182/115. That's a hypertensive crisis. That means my grandmother could have a stroke right now. Could die right now. And this man doesn't care because he's decided we're criminals who need to prove we deserve basic human dignity." Richard stood up from his desk, his face reddening. "Ma'am, you need to turn that off. You're disrupting operations." "I'm documenting what you're doing to us," Jasmine said, turning the camera back to him. "I'm making sure everyone sees exactly how you treat black passengers. How you weaponize your authority to torture elderly disabled women because you've decided they don't deserve the seats they paid for. Turn off that camera or I'm calling security," Richard threatened. "Call them," Jasmine said, her voice steady now despite her tears. "Call security. Call your supervisor. Call whoever you want. Because 50,000 people are watching this right now and they all see exactly what you're doing." The live stream counter was indeed climbing rapidly. 10,000 viewers. 20,000. 30,000. Comments were flooding in faster than anyone could read them. Call 911 for her. This is elder abuse. I'm calling American Airlines right now. #Gate C17. Someone help that woman. This is exactly why we need to record everything. Jasmine addressed the camera directly, her voice carrying across the silent gate area. This is American Airlines, Gate C17, Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. We have valid tickets. We have a medical emergency. And this man is blocking us from life-saving medical care because we're black and he's decided that's enough reason to destroy us. She turned the camera to show the other passengers, all of them watching now, all of them holding phones, all of them witnesses. For 90 minutes, these people watched my grandmother suffer and did nothing. They recorded. They stared. But nobody helped. Nobody stood up to this man. Nobody said this is wrong. A pilot in uniform walking through the terminal stopped in his tracks, pulled out his phone, started watching the live stream while simultaneously watching the scene unfold in front of him. His face showed growing horror as he realized what he was witnessing. My grandmother needs to get to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Jasmine continued. She has a consultation tomorrow morning that could save her life. This is her last chance. And if we don't get on a plane tonight, she'll miss it. And this man knows that. He knows he's potentially killing her. And he doesn't care. The live stream counter hit 50,000 viewers. Then 60,000. People were sharing it, tagging news outlets, tagging American Airlines, tagging civil rights organizations. #Gate C17 was trending locally, starting to trend nationally. Richard reached for his phone, his hands shaking now as he realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. I'm calling security to have you both removed from the terminal. Do it, Jasmine said, her voice hard. Remove a dying elderly woman from an airport while everyone watches. Show everyone exactly who you are. A woman in an American Airlines supervisor uniform came rushing from the back office, clearly alerted by someone that something was going very wrong at Gate C17. Behind her, 2 EMTs with medical bags were running through the terminal, having been called by someone watching the live stream who dialed 911. And within 5 minutes, Jasmine's live stream would reach the one person who could freeze the entire airline, who could make American Airlines stop everything they were doing and answer for what was happening to Evelyn Morrison. The live stream hit 100,000 viewers. News vans were already being dispatched to the airport. American Airlines crisis management team's phones were exploding with notifications. And in an executive office 30 miles away, Regional Vice President Diane Washington was watching the live stream with tears of rage streaming down her face, already calling for a helicopter to get her to DFW immediately. Richard Brennan's 90 minutes of unchallenged cruelty were about to collide with the viral power of truth and the fury of witnesses who could no longer look away. The EMTs reached Gate C17 first, their medical bags in hand, moving with the urgency of professionals who understood that seconds mattered. The lead paramedic, a black woman in her 40s named Yolanda Harris, dropped to her knees beside Evelyn's wheelchair and immediately began assessing her vital signs. Ma'am, my name is Yolanda. I'm a paramedic. Can you tell me your name? Evelyn came the weak response. Evelyn Morrison. Yolanda pulled out a blood pressure cuff and wrapped it around Evelyn's arm, then checked the reading on her wrist monitor. Her face went serious as she saw the numbers. Mrs. Morrison, your blood pressure is 182/115. You're in hypertensive crisis. We need to get you to a hospital right now. Richard stepped forward, his voice uncertain now but still trying to assert authority. Wait, I didn't authorize medical transport. This passenger is under investigation for ticket fraud and... Yolanda's head snapped up, her voice cutting through his words like a blade. You don't authorize medical emergencies. I don't need your permission to save someone's life. Now step aside before I have you charged with interfering with emergency medical services. Richard stepped back, his face pale, finally realizing how badly this situation had deteriorated. Jasmine's live stream was still running, still climbing in viewers. 150,000 now. 200,000. The comments section was a flood of outrage and demands for action. Behind the EMTs came 2 American Airlines executives in suits, walking quickly, their faces showing the controlled panic of people managing a crisis that was already viral. The lead executive, a man in his 50s named Michael Torres, approached Richard's desk. "Mr. Brennan, what is the status of this verification?" Richard turned to his supervisor with visible relief, thinking rescue had arrived. "I've been conducting a fraud investigation on these tickets. The payment method seemed irregular and I was following proper protocol." "Be specific," Torres interrupted. "What exactly made the ticket suspicious? What flags appeared in the system?" Richard pulled up his computer screen, his hands shaking slightly. "Well, the purchase seemed. The timing was. There was something about the payment method that just seemed off." "Show me the fraud alert," Torres said, his voice hard. "Show me the system flag that triggered this investigation." Richard scrolled through screens, clicking through menus, his face growing more panicked as he searched. "It was here earlier. The system showed there was an indicator that." "There's nothing," Torres said, leaning over to look at the screen himself. "No fraud alert. No payment flag. No system warning of any kind. These tickets were purchased normally 3 weeks ago with a valid credit card and there's not a single irregularity in the entire transaction history." He straightened up and looked at Richard with an expression of barely controlled fury. "You detained these passengers for 90 minutes based on nothing. No system alert. No actual evidence of fraud. Just your own judgment that something seemed off." Around them, Jasmine's livestream was capturing everything. 250,000 viewers now. CNN had picked it up. Local Dallas news stations were dispatching crews. #Gate C17 was trending #1 nationally. The man who'd offered water earlier now stepped forward. "I'm Robert Hayes. I've been watching this situation for the last 20 minutes. That gate agent racially profiled the disabled elderly woman and has denied her medical care for over an hour and a half." His voice carried authority and conviction. "I watched him refuse bathroom access to a stroke survivor. I watched him deny water to a woman on multiple medications. I watched him block a child and her dying grandmother from boarding 3 legitimate flights. And I watched dozens of passengers and staff walk past and do nothing because he had a badge and they didn't want to get involved." Torres pulled out his phone, stepped away, made a rapid call. Within seconds he returned. "Mr. Brennan, you're relieved of duty effective immediately. Security will escort you from the terminal." Richard's face went white. "What?" "No, I was following protocol. I was doing my job." "You were doing nothing of the kind," Torres said. "You lied about system alerts. You invented fraud that doesn't exist. You detained passengers based on bias, not evidence. Security, please escort Mr. Brennan out." 2 airport security officers approached. Richard looked around desperately, seeing his career imploding in real time, seeing the phones recording his humiliation the same way he'd let them record Evelyn's. "I want to speak to my union rep," he said, grasping at anything. "I have rights. I followed procedure." "You have the right to leave with security or be removed by force," Torres said. As Richard was escorted away, still protesting, Torres turned to Evelyn and Jasmine. "Mrs. Morrison, Miss Morrison, I cannot adequately express how sorry I am for what you've experienced. This was a catastrophic failure on every level." But even as he spoke, even as the EMTs worked to stabilize Evelyn's blood pressure, even as the situation finally seemed to be resolving, everyone knew this was just the beginning. Because 300,000 people had now watched Jasmine's livestream. Because American Airline stock was already dropping as investors saw the viral disaster unfolding. Because news helicopters were approaching the airport. And because in an office building 30 miles away, Regional Vice President Diane Washington had just boarded an emergency helicopter, her face set with the kind of fury that came from watching a member of her own community nearly killed by the racism of an employee at the airline she helped run. The convergence was just beginning. And Richard Brennan, being escorted out in disgrace, had no idea how much worse his situation was about to become, or how many people were about to demand accountability for what he'd done to Evelyn Morrison. But one thing was already clear to everyone watching the live stream, to everyone at Gate C17, to everyone who'd been silent for 90 minutes and was now scrambling to show they cared. Jasmine Morrison had done what none of them had been brave enough to do. She'd made them see. She'd refused to let her grandmother be invisible. And she'd forced an entire airline to stop and answer for the cruelty happening in plain sight. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors drew closer, audible even inside the terminal. Passengers looked up, confused about why a helicopter would be landing at the airport. But Michael Torres knew exactly who was arriving, and his face showed a mixture of relief and apprehension. Regional Vice President Diane Washington had been in a quarterly review meeting when her assistant burst in with a tablet showing Jasmine's live stream. She'd watched 30 seconds before ordering an emergency helicopter. 23 minutes later, she was touching down on a rarely used helipad near Terminal C. Diane Washington was 52 years old, a black woman who'd risen through American Airlines ranks over 28 years through excellence and determination. She'd faced her own share of discrimination, had filed complaints that went nowhere, had watched patterns of bias that leadership dismissed as isolated incidents. But she'd kept pushing, kept achieving until she had enough power to maybe, finally, force real change. She walked through the terminal with 4 people behind her, head of legal, head of HR, head of crisis communications, and her personal assistant carrying a tablet still streaming Jasmine's broadcast. Her heels clicked on the tile with the rhythm of someone who meant business. At gate C-17, EMT Yolanda had gotten Evelyn's blood pressure down slightly with medication, but it was still dangerously high. They'd started in 4, given her oxygen, and were preparing to transport her to the emergency room. Jasmine sat beside her grandmother, still live streaming, now at 400,000 viewers. Diane walked straight past the airline executives, past the security officers, past everyone else, and went directly to Evelyn. She knelt beside the wheelchair, her voice gentle but carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "Mrs. Morrison, my name is Diane Washington. I'm Regional Vice President of American Airlines. I've been watching what happened to you on livestream. I am profoundly, deeply sorry for every single thing you've endured in this terminal." Evelyn looked at her through exhausted, pain-filled eyes. "I just wanted to go to my doctor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's all I wanted. To go to Johns Hopkins so maybe they can fix my heart." Diane's own eyes filled with tears. "I know. And you will get there. I'm personally insuring it. But first, we need to get you medical care right here, right now." She stood and turned to the EMTs. "What's her status?" "Critical hypertensive emergency," Yolanda said. "We need to transport to Parkland Memorial immediately. Her blood pressure is still 175/108 despite medication. She's at high risk for stroke or cardiac event. Transport her," Diane said. "American Airlines will cover all medical expenses. And I'll be following you to the hospital." Then she turned to face Richard, who was still being detained by security nearby. The live stream camera captured the moment their eyes met. "Mr. Brennan, you're not just relieved of duty. You're terminated. Effective immediately. Security, please escort him not just from this terminal but from all American Airlines property. He's permanently banned from our facilities." Richard's face showed shock and denial. "You can't fire me without union process. I have rights. I followed fraud prevention protocols." "Show me," Diane interrupted coldly. "Show me the fraud alert on your screen. Show me the system flag that justified detaining them." Michael Torres, standing nearby, spoke up. "There is none. We've already checked. There was never any flag, any alert, any system warning. Nothing." Diane turned back to Richard, her voice cutting. "You lied. You detained a disabled elderly woman for 90 minutes based on nothing but your own bias. You saw a black woman in a wheelchair and decided she couldn't possibly have legitimate tickets. You denied her bathroom access, water, medical care. You blocked her from 3 flights. You put her life at risk because you couldn't imagine that someone who looks like her could afford to fly." "That's not true," Richard protested weakly. "I was just being thorough." "You were being racist," Diane said flatly. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. Security, remove him." As Richard was escorted away, Diane addressed the crowd and the live stream camera that Jasmine still held. "I'm Diane Washington, Regional Vice President of American Airlines. What happened to Mrs. Morrison is unacceptable. It's a fireable offense and a moral catastrophe. This is not who we claim to be as a company. This is not the standard we hold ourselves to. She looked directly into the camera. Mrs. Morrison and Miss Morrison will be transported to the hospital right now. Once Mrs. Morrison is stable, we will fly them to Baltimore on a private medical charter at our complete expense. Mr. Brennan has been terminated, and I will personally review every single passenger interaction he's had over his 15-year career to see if there are other victims of his bias. Jasmine finally lowered her phone, the live stream ending after reaching 500,000 viewers. She looked at Diane with exhausted gratitude and remaining distrust. Why did it take my live stream going viral for anyone to help us? Why did we have to suffer for 90 minutes before someone with authority cared? Diane had no good answer. Because there isn't one. Because the system failed you. Because too many people saw and did nothing. Because your grandmother's suffering wasn't real to them until it was public. I can't undo what happened. I can only promise to do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't happen again. The EMTs lifted Evelyn onto a stretcher. As they wheeled her toward the ambulance, Jasmine walked beside her, holding her grandmother's hand. Evelyn looked up at her granddaughter, the girl who'd been brave when everyone else was silent, who'd fought when everyone else was complicit. You made them see me, baby, Evelyn whispered. Just like I taught you. You made them see. But as they loaded Evelyn into the ambulance, as the doors closed and the sirens started, everyone at gate C-17 knew that being seen wasn't the same as being safe. That viral justice was better than no justice, but it shouldn't have required a 15-year-old going viral to force adults to do the right thing. Richard Brennan was terminated and humiliated, but Evelyn Morrison's medical crisis was far from over. And the question of whether she'd survive to make it to Johns Hopkins, whether Jasmine's bold stand had saved her grandmother or come too late, still hung unanswered as the ambulance raced toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. The ambulance screamed through Dallas traffic, lights flashing, sirens wailing, racing against the clock to get Evelyn to Parkland Memorial's emergency room. Inside, Jasmine held her grandmother's hand while Yolanda monitored vital signs that remained dangerously unstable. Blood pressure's climbing again, Yolanda said to her partner. 186/112. She's not responding to the meds like she should. What does that mean? Jasmine asked, terror sharp in her voice. It means the stress of the last 90 minutes did serious damage, Yolanda said gently. Her heart is struggling. We're doing everything we can. At Parkland, a trauma team was waiting. They rushed Evelyn into a critical care bay, hooking her to monitors, starting additional IVs, calling for the cardiology team. Jasmine was made to wait outside, pacing the hallway, calling her mother who was still at work. Mom, Jasmine sobbed into the phone. They almost killed her. That gate agent almost killed Grandma. Her mother, Patricia, was already leaving the hospital where she worked, racing to Parkland. I'm coming, baby. Hold on. I'm coming. Diane Washington arrived at the hospital 20 minutes after the ambulance, going straight to Jasmine in the waiting room. How is she? They won't tell me anything, Jasmine said. I'm not 18. They said I have to wait for my mom. Diane sat beside her, and for a moment they were just two black women who understood the weight of what had happened. Your live stream has 12 million views now. CNN is running it. The FBI is opening a civil rights investigation. You did something incredibly brave. I was just trying to save my grandmother, Jasmine said. You did more than that, Diane said quietly. You showed the world what we face every day. The suspicion. The cruelty. The way our humanity gets questioned over and over until sometimes it kills us. A doctor emerged from the treatment area, her face serious. Family of Evelyn Morrison? Jasmine stood up. I'm her granddaughter. My mom is on the way. Mrs. Morrison is in acute heart failure, the doctor said. The extended period of severe hypertension caused significant strain on her cardiac system. We've stabilized her for now, but she's critical. We need to discuss transport to Johns Hopkins as soon as she's stable enough to travel. Will she survive? Jasmine asked, the question she'd been terrified to voice. The doctor's expression was careful. The next 24 hours are critical. The stress and delay in treatment complicated her condition significantly. We're doing everything we can. Meanwhile, at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, the fallout was accelerating. American Airlines had grounded all Richard Brennan's colleagues for immediate retraining. News crews were interviewing passengers who'd witnessed the detention. And in a holding cell at airport security, Richard sat alone, finally beginning to understand that his 90 minutes of cruelty would define the rest of his life. Diane had promised to review his entire 15-year record. What she would find would be damning: 23 complaints from passengers, 19 involving people of color, all dismissed as customer service issues rather than investigated as discrimination. A pattern so clear it should have resulted in termination years ago, but instead had been enabled by a system that protected employees over passengers. Back at Parkland, Patricia arrived and embraced Jasmine, both of them crying. Then they sat together in the waiting room, waiting to see if Evelyn would survive the damage that 90 minutes of racism had inflicted on her already fragile heart. Diane stayed with them, making calls to arrange the medical charter to Baltimore, coordinating with Johns Hopkins, ensuring that if Evelyn survived the night, she'd get to her consultation. But everyone in that waiting room understood the brutal truth. They were racing against time that had already been stolen from them. 90 minutes that might be the difference between life and death. And in Operating Room 3, cardiac surgeons worked frantically to save a 73-year-old civil rights hero who'd survived police brutality in Selma only to nearly die from bureaucratic cruelty in an airport. The question of whether justice would come too late to matter was still unanswered as machines beeped and doctors worked, and a family prayed that their beloved Evelyn would fight one more time, survive one more battle, live to see the accountability her granddaughter's courage had demanded. Evelyn Morrison survived the night. Barely. The cardiac team at Parkland worked 12 hours to stabilize her enough for the medical charter flight to Johns Hopkins. 3 days later, she underwent emergency valve replacement surgery, the very procedure she'd been traveling to discuss when Richard Brennan decided she looked suspicious. The surgery was successful, but recovery was brutal. 3 weeks in intensive care. 2 months of cardiac rehabilitation. Permanent damage to her heart muscle from the hypertensive crisis at gate C17. The doctors were clear. The 90-minute detention had accelerated her heart failure by months, maybe years. Richard Brennan's termination was just the beginning. The FBI investigation uncovered his 15-year pattern: 23 discrimination complaints, 19 involving passengers of color. All had been dismissed by management as customer service issues. He was charged with federal disability discrimination and reckless endangerment. 11 months later, a jury convicted him on both counts. 18 months in federal prison. $50,000 fine. Permanent ban from the aviation industry. His wife filed for divorce 3 weeks after the verdict, telling reporters she couldn't recognize the man she'd married in the viral video of him denying an elderly woman bathroom access. American Airlines paid a $2.8 million settlement to Evelyn and Jasmine. More importantly, they implemented Evelyn's law. Any passenger with a medical emergency gets immediate supervisor and medical team notification, zero tolerance for denying medical care or bathroom access, and mandatory third-party review before any boarding denial. Diane Washington was promoted to Senior Vice President of Customer Experience and Equity, with Evelyn's case as her mandate for change. And if you've watched Evelyn's entire story, seen how close she came to dying because one man weaponized his badge against her humanity, but you haven't liked this video or subscribed to this channel, ask yourself why. Are you any different from those passengers who watched her suffer for 90 minutes? Every like pushes this to more people. Every subscription supports accountability. Don't just witness injustice. Amplify it until systems have to change. Like and subscribe now. 2 years later, Evelyn is 75, in a wheelchair but stable. Jasmine just graduated high school with plans to study medicine at Howard University, focusing on healthcare equity. Richard Brennan got out of prison after 16 months for good behavior. He works retail now, lives alone, tells anyone who'll listen that he was unfairly targeted, that political correctness destroyed his career. He's learned nothing, changed nothing, still believes he did nothing wrong. Gate C17 at Dallas-Fort Worth has a small plaque now. In honor of Evelyn Morrison, may we always choose compassion over suspicion. Jasmine keeps a photo in her dorm room, Her grandmother at Johns Hopkins post-surgery, weak but alive, giving a defiant fist in the air. Evelyn wrote on it, "They tried to ground me. You gave me wings." The story of Gate C-17 became a training case study, in medical schools about healthcare disparities, in law schools about civil rights, in business schools about corporate accountability. But for Evelyn, sitting in her church on Sundays, volunteering at the community center teaching young people about civil rights history, the lesson was simpler and more personal. She tells the kids about Selma, about being beaten for demanding her rights. Then she tells them about Gate C-17, about being detained for buying a plane ticket. 60 years apart, she says. Same hatred. Different uniform. That's why we can't stop fighting. That's why we have to make them see us, over and over, generation after generation, until seeing us means seeing our humanity automatically. And when someone asks if she's bitter, if she hates Richard Brennan, Evelyn shakes her head. I don't hate him, she says. I pity him. He had power and he used it for cruelty. He could have helped an elderly woman get to a doctor. Instead, he nearly killed her to prove he could. That's a sad way to live and a worse thing to be remembered for. She pauses, then adds, but I'm grateful to my granddaughter. When I was too weak to fight, she fought for me. When I was invisible, she made them see me. That's what love looks like. That's what courage looks like. And that's why we're still here. Here is the final message. Sometimes the boldest act of love is refusing to be silent while someone you love is being destroyed. And sometimes one voice, amplified by truth and courage, can freeze an entire system long enough for justice to arrive. Not perfect justice. Not fast enough justice. But justice nonetheless.